So on this channel, we talk about interactions between different cultures, whether that's on the macro or micro level. Other cultures are so fascinating to learn about, but sometimes our values or ways of doing things can clash. This conflict is what I'm going to talk about today. It's called culture shock. So culture shock is something that anyone that's been outside of their home country for an extended period of time has probably experienced. I say long-term because if you just go for a few weeks or even a few months, you probably stay in the honeymoon phase where everything is new and exciting and you kind of don't really pay attention to the differences, at least not in a negative way. Culture shock, sometimes it's homesickness, sometimes it's difficulty adjusting to the differences, and no matter how open-minded you are, I guarantee that you'll experience it at some point. It's certainly happened to me. Your experience will vary whether you're studying abroad for a few months, working for a few years as an expatriate, or immigrating to another country for the long term. So culture shock happens in 4 phases. First is the honeymoon phase, where everything is new and exciting. And this is great, but it lasts like 3 months, so enjoy it while it lasts. The negotiation phase, where you're kind of becoming frustrated with the differences. The adjustment period, where you're getting used to the new normal. There's a lot of problem solving and trying to understand. And then finally, the adaptation phase, where you've reached mastery or you've become bicultural. Culture shock is part of an adaptation to the rules of a different culture. It can make you question your own culture and learn a lot about your own culture, but it can be really uncomfortable. Culture shock is a cycle, so it can occur repeatedly while you're living outside of your native country. You might learn that things you thought were universal are just weird quirks of your country. For example, it's common to tip waiters, taxi drivers, hairstylists, and other service professions in the United States, whereas in Japan, tipping is seen as unnecessary and rude because you've already paid for a good service. In terms of challenges, the language barrier can be a big challenge for those living abroad. If you can learn some of the language before departing, you'll have an easier time adapting and you'll get more out of the experience. Many language classes have cultural components, so you can familiarize yourself with the culture of the country that you're going to visit. While abroad, you may be tempted to stick among people from your own culture. So study abroad programs often fail at delivering on their promises of language learning and cultural understanding because of this. I'm not saying this to accuse anyone. I'm definitely guilty of it myself. I've met some of my best friends by hanging out more with English speakers while I was abroad. And we can see examples of this in history. For example, Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald in Paris in the 1920s with The Lost Generation. There's a comfort of home and familiar cultural rules when spending time with people from your own culture. So I don't mean to take away from that or tell people they shouldn't. I just think if you want to grow from your experience abroad, it's important to try and adapt to your new culture and make an effort to integrate yourself and make friends who are locals. And I know that sometimes it's easier said than done. I'm not saying you can't do both. You should do both. Another challenge with culture shock is implicit versus explicit cultures. So this phenomenon exists on a spectrum, with some cultures being more one than the other, but it can be confusing if you move from an explicit culture to an implicit culture. For example, the United States is an explicit culture. Rules are clearly explained because we have a history of immigration, people coming from all over the world, and so it's normal for us to kind of make things clear, whereas in an older country like France, rules are expected to be understood without a detailed explanation. People might even think that you think they're stupid if you try and explain things too explicitly. And Japan is an extremely implicit culture. There are many societal customs and rules that Japanese people are expected to follow. These are things that parents will explain to their children, but adults are expected to know without an explanation. On the other hand, foreigners are not expected to know most of the rules, but I can give a specific example where Japanese people did explain because it was something important. For example, when eating with chopsticks, never stick them upright in a bowl because it reminds them of a Buddhist funeral where you stick incense in a bowl of rice. A related rule is never pass food between chopsticks because that similarly evokes funerals. In general, and I'm speaking from my experience and also research that I've done, Japanese culture is more subdued. So vocal criticism is seen as rude, hierarchies are more respected. So there's less of like a vocal debate at meetings, for example. You'll almost never hear a Japanese person say no. Instead, they might say something like, that might be kind of difficult, and they're implying that it's not possible. So in Japanese culture, that's showing you respect by not being confrontational. I think it's important not to judge other customs as good or bad, but instead to understand that things work differently in that culture. And especially when you first get there, just wait like 6 months until you get used to it and you see why they do things differently. You can still have your opinions, I guess, but you're not going to change their culture by forcing your way of doing things on them. One foreigner in their country is not going to change the rules. So, as much as possible, you should try and adapt yourself. This process can and will likely result in culture shock at some point. And it's okay, it happens. Take a breather and try again tomorrow. Finally, once you overcome most of your culture shock and you've adapted to your new environment, you're still not safe. Culture shock is a cycle, so it can happen again, although it's usually not as bad as the first time. You can also experience reverse culture shock when you go back to your home country. So reverse culture shock is similar to culture shock, except that you're comparing your new experiences to your old ones. Your friends from back home may not be able to relate to your new experiences. You might find that you've grown as a person and they've stayed the same. If you have the opportunity to live abroad, whether it's to work, study, or even immigrate, I really encourage you to give it a go. Since it can take up to a year to adapt to culture shock, the longer the better. Ultimately, while culture shock is uncomfortable to experience, it's a sign that you're growing. For most of human history, the reaction to culture shock has not been pretty. More people need to experience other cultures and overcome culture shock so that we can understand each other better.